Hey friends, welcome again to the 5 essential functions of the church. Dr. Randy Turpin here, your instructor, and I'm excited about the lesson here today because we're dealing with worship and prayer. Worship and prayer, and these are big topics. I cannot give you an exhaustive teaching on worship and prayer just in one session. But I want to take you back to the diagram that summarizes the 5 essential functions just as a review, and I want to make an emphasis here. Okay, let's look at this together. The 5 essential functions here in my baseball diamond. I've placed on the pitcher's mound worship and prayer because nothing starts in the work of the church until worship and prayer is going on. I believe everything should be built around worship. In prayer, ministry should be conceived in times of prayer. Getting the mandate of heaven. Here's where apostolic leadership is needed. Remember the role of the apostle. Apostolic leadership is to bring us into alignment with the culture of heaven. And what better place to do that than in worship and prayer as we come around the throne of God and as we are interceding, as we're listening for the voice of God. That's where the prophetic comes in. We're listening for his voice, and this great exchange takes place between heaven and earth in this place of worship and prayer. Again, I'm just reviewing. We're going to look at this in more detail in this whole lesson. Today's lesson is about worship and prayer. But then we move on to home plate, which is evangelism. We're going out into the world and we're bringing people in. And then as people are getting saved, we're getting them connected in fellowship, in relationship with one another. And then as we get them connected in relationships, then we disciple them as disciples of Jesus Christ. And part of their discipling is they become influencers in the world, impacting every sphere of influence, and we deploy them. That's what the deployment part of all of this is all about. So that's the big picture there of what we're trying to cover in the 5 essential functions of the church. But here today, we're talking about worship and prayer. Now, I like to think of these 5 in terms of some of them have to do with us reaching up. Others have to do with us reaching out. Other functions have to do with us reaching in. Up, out, and in. Okay? And as we touch upon these, if I remember to do so, I'll point out which one is an up function, which one's an out function, and which one's an inward function. Well, worship and prayer is that upward function. It ties in beautifully with the priority we talked about in lesson 1. Priority 1 is that we be lovers of God and lovers of men, of people. Love God, love people. Remember that? So we're talking about this vertical relationship that directly impacts every other relationship. Every horizontal relationship is impacted by this vertical relationship, our relationship with God the Father. And in our times of worship, in times of prayer, we're coming into what I call a throne room awareness. And I'm just elevating here the essential function of worship and prayer here today. It's not indispensable. I have heard people erroneously say that our time of worship and our times of coming together, the whole purpose of it is to prepare us for the ministry of the Word. That makes it sound like worship is not all that important. It's just something that prepares you to hear the Word of God. I don't like elevating one function above another like that. Okay, that's like saying that, well, I just don't like that. Okay, if anything, I think that the teaching and preaching of the Word prepares us to worship God. So, and worshiping the Lord is what we're going to be doing through all eternity. We were made for the purpose of bringing pleasure to Him and to worship Him. Okay? So let's not compromise the worship aspect of this. And don't worry, it's not going to get out of balance. Not if you're holding all 5 functions in view. But do not minimize the role of worship. Worship him in spirit and truth. It's what God is looking for. Jesus said, he said the Father's looking for those who can exegete Scripture. No, that's not what he's looking for. God's looking for those who can win 1,000 souls next week. No, that's not what it says he's looking for looking for. Or God's looking for those that can do this. Listen, he's looking for those who will worship him in spirit and in truth. And the beautiful thing about worship is it brings us into this awareness of who's in charge, who's in control. We exalt his lordship. We declare his goodness. And we draw his presence into everything that we're doing. Please aim to live a presence of God-centered life. If you're a congregational leader, please aim to have a church that's presence of God-centered. Wouldn't you love to have a church where you walk into the doors even before anybody else shows up, the tangible presence of God is in the room? Some of you know what I'm talking about. If you'll be a person who hungers and thirsts for the presence of God, he will show up. And what I desire is not just his visitation, but his habitation. That we be a people that we have such a hunger for his presence and his glory that presence, that awareness of his presence never leaves us, but that we live constantly aware of him. Oh, I could preach. I'm going to try not to here. But I know some people like to put evangelism in the first place. I don't really have a problem with that. But the reason I've placed worship and prayer here in the very center is because what evangelism is really all about is we're recruiting more worshipers. We're recruiting more worshipers for God. More people who will worship him. All right? So, and I think that his presence, the Lord's presence, and the prophetic lines up beautifully with this too. The apostolic and the prophetic right here in this central focus. The apostolic having to do with alignment with the culture of heaven. The prophetic having to do with hearing the voice of God and then manifesting that voice to the people. It aligns beautifully with this whole role of worship and prayer. Now, prayer here, why have I placed it here and not created a second category, a separate category for it? Now, certainly there's a need for an emphasis on prayer that goes beyond just worship, okay? Jesus, he told us that his Father's house would be called a house of prayer for all nations. You could develop a whole ministry function model just around the whole concept of the church being a house of prayer. That's beautiful. I don't mind if you do that, okay? And I have had that emphasis at many points in my ministry. And to see that there's a whole difference between a church that has prayer ministries and a church that is a prayer ministry. The entire church is a prayer ministry. There should be. Where everything about it. If you're changing a baby's diaper in the nursery, it should be a prayer ministry, part of the prayer ministry of the church. As the ladies or gentlemen, whoever's changing the diapers, they're blessing those children. You know, if you're a custodian in the church, it should be a prayer ministry. As you're cleaning the church, you're praying over the church. You're blessing the church, you know. Everything. Prayer touches everything, okay? It should be integrated in everything. I'm working on another course, putting a plug in here, just simply called Prayer Culture. Prayer Culture. It's another leadership course, working on. Hope I can finish it soon. Still scripting it out. But that I'll deal more in depth with all of that. And when we talk about worship and prayer here as functions in the church, don't make the mistake I made. You know, years ago, I saw the importance of prayer. I was a praying person myself and really was aiming to be a man of prayer. But I scheduled a prayer meeting on Friday nights, and I thought, well, here's our prayer ministry. And at first, 30 people showed up, and in that group of 30, it began to dwindle down, though, after a few weeks, until one night I showed up, and I was the only one there. and said, oh God, what's going on here? And I was talking to a friend of mine the next week, and I said, hey, your church, and he was a pastor of a larger church in town, and I asked him, can you help me out here? Why is it that I can't get people to come out for a prayer meeting? I mean, your church is known to be a praying church. And he said, Randy, how many opportunities are you giving your church to pray? I said, well, what do you mean, how many? If I can't get them to come to my one opportunity, how can I expect them to come to other opportunities? He said, well, there's your problem. You're expecting everybody to come to your one prayer meeting. I mean, what works for one person's not going to work for everybody. What fits one person's schedule is not going to fit everybody's schedule. What fits one person's temperament is not going to fit everybody's temperament. Some people like to have experiences of prayer where it's just quiet and they're waiting in the presence of God. Other people want to get into a spiritual warfare mode in prayer, and they're loud and boisterous in their praying. Others like corporate prayer, some like private prayer, some like small group prayer. Hey, I've written a book on 101 prayer models. Hang on just a second. You can go to Amazon.com and order it. 101 prayer models. Yes, 101. After I got out of that meeting with that pastor friend of mine, I started implementing multiple and varied prayer models, different opportunities, different times in the week for people to pray, and different approaches to prayer, and the thing just exploded. A great prayer revival broke out that resulted in an invasion of God's presence. We had a sustained revival there for a few years. Lasted a few years. It all began with a revival of prayer. Okay? But why have I placed prayer and worship together? I mean, worship and intercession work beautifully together. In fact, I love the harp and bowl model established and made popular by Mike Bickle. Mike Bickle was the founder of the International House of Prayer. The way they so beautifully have integrated prayer and worship in some of their corporate gatherings where they have 24/7 prayer going on constantly. It's been going on for years. Constant prayer meeting. And I just love the way that's integrated, to where we're worshiping God and we're praying. We're worshiping God and we're praying. And even integrating prophecy in that, prophesying. Sometimes we don't need to be praying. We just need to be prophetically declaring some things that God has established in our hearts, okay? So this is an essential function in the church. Essential function. And we need to assess, how essential are we really making worship? How essential are we really making prayer in our congregations? Now, what we're talking about here, worship and prayer is something that is probably modeled best in the large corporate gathering of believers. The largest gathering you've got in your church, there's where it's modeled the best. But really, it's a model. It is the pattern that should be setting the pace for everybody for when they're in their small groups, and then even for when it's just them with their families or them individually, that we all become praying and worshiping people. The whole idea of worship and prayer in the church is that we will become a praying and worshiping people 7 days a week. Okay? If all your worship ministry is about that hour block of time, having a good experience in worship there, and it's not somehow impacting people, making them a people who worship God continually through the week, then you're falling short with your worship ministry. All right? Likewise with your prayer ministry. If it's just something you do in a small block of the church and it's not impacting the way the whole church is functioning and in the way that people are living their lives to become more prayerful people, then the prayer ministry is falling short. Do you see what I'm saying? So it sets the tone, it sets the pace. Your corporate gathering, that is a great function. I'd say build your church around that. Build your church around the large corporate gathering of worship and prayer and that corporate assembly where the presence of God is hungered and desired and hungered for and desired, and where the manifest presence of God is tangible there among you. Don't settle for anything less than the manifest presence of God. Let that be sustained in your corporate gatherings. And may it be sustained in the lives of individuals as they go forth from there. Encourage that and don't change the subject. Make it always about His presence, being in His presence. Okay? So that is so important. That is where we interface heaven. We've talked about that. That's where we get renewed in our intimacy with God. Everything begins there. Everything gets centered in on worship and prayer. Now, for this to happen, we need to establish some things. In each of these lessons, I want to talk about what we need to establish if we're really going to function effectively in each of these functions. So what do we need to establish in order to function effectively and faithfully in worship and prayer? We need to establish the presence of God. The presence of God is far more important than the presence of the preacher, the presence of more people in the pews, the presence of the worship leader. It's the presence of God. Presence of God is more important than you getting through the agenda for the day, the order of service. Host His presence. Learn to host the presence of God in your gatherings. So we need to establish presence. And we need to establish a spirit of excellence in what we do. Now, I don't mean a performance mentality, but let's be excellent in our worship to the Lord. Okay? Those who are leading in worship need to be, first of all, worshipers themselves, even when the spotlight's not on them. If they can't worship the Lord and be totally satisfied and content, privately being a worshiper of God, then they probably don't need to be on the platform. What they do on the platform is to be the overflow of what they already have been becoming in their life prior to them being asked to lead in a song or to worship, okay? It's not performance. There's only one audience in a worship gathering, and you know this. The audience is not, it's not the people in the pew. The audience is the one who's seated on the throne. It is all unto Him, okay? Now, this is our upward focus, worship and prayer. Everything begins here in this place of worship and prayer. Everything is centered here in this place of worship and prayer. Ministry should be conceived in this place of worship and prayer. We had some people in one church I pastor, they had an interest in missions. Pastor, we want to get some things started in the area of missions. I said, great, form a prayer group that's focused on missions first and see what God conceives. So they formed a prayer group that met weekly to pray for missionaries and missionary endeavors. And out of that, God conceived in them and birthed through them some of our missions strategy. Can you see what I'm talking about? We had another group of people that really had a burden for souls to be saved. I asked them to form a prayer group on Monday mornings to pray for the salvation of souls. All right? And they would actually bring in prayer request slips and lay them on the floor and get on their faces before God, crying out over the names of people written upon those slips of paper. Evangelistic ministry can be birthed out of such times as that. Can you see that? Let everything be birthed in prayer. Let it be saturated in prayer and worship. I think I've probably said enough about all of that. But so we need to just we need to have an establishing of the presence of God, a spirit of excellence in all that we do. We need to make sure that in our worship and prayer that we provide a meaningful opportunity for congregational engagement. Okay? If you're on the platform, you're there to lead people, not to perform. If the congregation's not led into what you're doing, then it's not effective and it's not faithful to why you're there. I've seen some worship leaders say, well, I'm just here to worship the Lord. I'm going to just pretend the congregation's not here, and I'm just going to be a worshiper for God. Listen, you're missing the whole point. Great, be that kind of a worshiper when you're at home alone, but if you've been appointed and anointed and assigned to lead the congregation, you'd better be aware of that congregation. You better be aware of whether or not they're engaged. If you're leading in a song or something and they're just not getting it, they're not connecting, move on to the next song. Okay? Be aware of where that congregation is in that whole experience. We have to provide meaningful opportunity for congregational engagement. It is, so we need to establish that opportunity for congregational engagement. We need to establish an intercessory mindset in a church. The place of worship and prayer is a place to cultivate a culture of we are a people who are for and not against. Well, of course, we're against sin, we're against evil and all of that, but we're for people. Some churches are known for what they're against. Well, that's the church that's against everything. Okay? We're to be a people that are for the salvation of souls. We are for deliverance. We're for repentance. We are for cleansing, for liberation. We are for healing. Okay? An intercessory mindset that needs to permeate every aspect of a ministry can be established in an atmosphere of worship and prayer. Can you see the function here is so essential? And we need to establish this mindset that we are a house of prayer for all nations, for all people groups, for people of every description. And if we're truly a house of prayer, we're not just a church that has prayer ministries, but we as a whole are a ministry of prayer, as I've already talked about that some. And, again, my aim is to see that the church is built around worship and prayer. Now let's take a bit of a survey, and I've provided a tool built right into the course to enable us to do this, and I'm going to do this for each of the functions, okay? First of all, do you understand the importance of the function of worship and prayer? How important is that function to you? Do you understand it? Now let's look also at stewardship. If it is important to us, then we're going to steward it well. How are we stewarding our time as it relates to worship and prayer? How much time is actually given in a calendar week or calendar month or within a given service to worship and to prayer? How important is it to us? I find that God will meet us more frequently when we make more time and space for Him. No, that's true. He'll show up in glory and power a lot more when we make time and space for Him to do so. So how are we stewarding our time? And also as it relates to worship and prayer, how are we stewarding our talent or personnel? Okay, do we have the right people in place? And are we utilizing the giftedness that's among us to the best of our ability? And treasure, how much of the church budget is going to go into this function? If this is an essential function, then the worship ministry deserves a place on the church budget. If prayer is an essential function, then prayer ministry deserves a place in the church budget. Okay? Are we budgeting money toward worship and prayer? It's an essential function. So there should be considerable consideration to what we're doing there, okay? Are we making room for the fivefold leadership gift that aligns with worship and prayer? In this case, it's the apostle and the prophet. Are we making room for the apostle? Are we making room for the prophet? Now, this leads right into a question. Is it necessary for there to be all five of these offices in a local church? An apostle, a prophet, an evangelist, a pastor, and a teacher? Do we need all five of those to be embodied in individuals within a church? Well, ideally, that would be great, okay? I haven't found too many churches that truly have those all five callings present. Some churches do. But here's the thing. If you don't have all five present within that congregation, then there needs to be an openness to allowing others from outside who have that calling and anointing to come in. If there's not an apostolic influence, then there needs to be somebody from outside that the church esteems as an apostolic leader, that they respect. If there's not a prophetic influence, there needs to be an openness to having, prophetic voices coming in. If there's not a strong God-called teacher, an openness to bring a teacher in and so forth, okay? So is there an openness and an honoring of the fivefold that would allow these gifts to function? Important question to consider. Are we honoring the essential role of the other functions? Be too easy to get self-absorbed in our own function. Those are in worship ministry. You can get to the point where, hey, it's all about worship. It's all about worship. Or those who are into prayer ministry, it's all about prayer. It's all about prayer. Listen, it's not all about prayer. It's not all about worship. It's also about evangelism. It's also about koinonia, fellowship. It's also about discipleship. It's also about deploying people into the world to impact culture and impact the world around us. I mean, all these other things are essential. This is why we call them essential functions. So the point I'm making is make sure that if you're in the area of worship and prayer, you're a worship leader, a musician, a singer, or you're an intercessor, praying person, make sure that you understand that you are there to serve those who function in the other areas. Worship and prayer serves all the other ministries. Yeah, just as the other ministries serve you too. But you are there to serve the others, not to elevate your own function above everybody else. Okay? Well, okay, that about wraps it up for lesson number 3. Next time, we're looking at lesson number 4, which is dealing with evangelism. Worship and prayer was all about reaching up. Evangelism is going to be all about reaching out. I'm so looking forward to lesson number 4.